In the year 2000, a man in South Carolina sent off a small sample of his DNA, expecting nothing more than a name. He wanted to know where his family came from before slavery erased the records, before the paper trail went cold somewhere on a plantation ledger with no first name attached. He got an answer, but it wasn't the answer anyone expected. It wasn't a country, it wasn't a tribe, it wasn't even a continent in any way scientists could easily explain. What came back from the lab didn't match anything in the database. Not one branch of the entire human family tree fit. For a moment, the geneticists who looked at the results thought the sample had been contaminated. They thought the machine had made an error. They ran it again. Same result. They ran it a third time. Same result. The DNA sitting in a vial in a South Carolina lab belonged to a lineage so old that, if the numbers were right, it split off from the rest of humanity before our species had finished becoming human at all. His name was Albert Perry. He had passed away years before any of this happened, so he never learned what his own blood was about to do to the textbooks. It was his descendants who had submitted the sample, hoping for some thread back to Africa, some clue buried in the genetic code that could do what slavery's record-keeping never allowed. Genealogy companies process thousands of these samples. Almost all of them slot neatly into known categories, branches of the human Y chromosome tree that geneticists have mapped for decades. Perry's sample did not slot in anywhere. It sat alone at a distance from every other lineage ever recorded, like a tree root buried so deep that no one had ever dug far enough to find it. The company that ran the test, Family Tree DNA, had seen plenty of unusual results before, but nothing like this. The technicians flagged it and sent it up the chain, eventually landing on the desk of a population geneticist named Michael Hammer at the University of Arizona, a man who had spent his career studying the deep history of the human Y chromosome. The piece of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, carrying with it a kind of genetic fingerprint of every man who ever lived back to the very first one. Every man alive today carries a Y chromosome that traces back, in an unbroken line, to a single male ancestor. Geneticists nicknamed him Y chromosome Adam, not because he was the only man alive at the time, but because he is the most recent common ancestor, through whom every living man's paternal line eventually converges. For years, the estimates placed this ancestor somewhere between 100,000 and 140,000 years ago, comfortably inside the time frame when modern Homo sapiens were emerging as a distinct species in Africa. It was a tidy number. It fit the story. Humans evolved, humans spread, and somewhere in that process, every father's line eventually narrowed down to one man. Albert Perry's DNA didn't just complicate that story, it seemed to tear a hole straight through it. When Hammer's team began comparing Perry's Y chromosome sequence against the rest of the human tree, they realized they were looking at something that predated the supposed root of the entire structure. If their calculations were correct, the lineage Perry carried branched away from all other human male lines not 100,000 years ago, not 140,000 years ago, but somewhere in the range of 237,000 to 581,000 years ago, with a central estimate landing at roughly 338,000 years. 338,000 years. That number alone was almost too strange to process. It placed the divergence of Perry's lineage before the earliest known fossils of anatomically modern humans. It suggested that whatever ancestor carried this version of the Y chromosome was walking the earth before our species, in the form we usually picture it, had even finished taking shape. Researchers gave this newly discovered branch a name, haplogroup A or 0, not A1, not A2, the labels already in use for previously known ancient branches. A or 0, a designation that essentially meant older than anything we've classified before, so old we had to invent a new place for it at the very base of the tree. If the human Y chromosome family tree is imagined as a single trunk with branches splitting off over hundreds of thousands of years, A0 wasn't just an early branch, it was something closer to a second trunk, growing out of the ground at a point so far back that it predated the moment most scientists believed the entire trunk had started growing. This wasn't a fossil dug out of a cave wall after lying dormant for hundreds of thousands of years. This was a living signature, carried quietly inside the cells of a man who had walked through 20th century South Carolina, who had lived an ordinary American life, completely unaware that his body held a genetic record stretching back further than the species itself was thought to exist as we know it. The implications, if the dating held up, were staggering. Two possibilities emerged from the data, and both of them were strange enough to make headlines. The first possibility was that this ancient Y chromosome had entered the modern human gene pool through interbreeding with another archaic human population, a relative species, distant cousins of Homo sapiens who split off long before and whose genes occasionally slipped back into our lineage through encounters we have almost no fossil record of. We already know this kind of thing happened. Neanderthal DNA lives on in people of non-African descent today. Denisovan DNA, an entirely separate archaic population, identified almost exclusively through genetic traces rather than abundant fossils, lives on in populations across Asia and the Pacific. If Perry's Y chromosome arrived through a similar event, it would mean there was another now-vanished population of early humans living somewhere in Africa. One we have no name for, no skeleton of, no campsite, no tool, nothing, except this one genetic echo surviving inside a man born thousands of generations later on a different continent entirely. The second possibility was almost as unsettling in its own way. Maybe there was no separate species involved at all. Maybe modern Homo sapiens simply emerged earlier than anyone had calculated, and shortly after emerging, splintered into small, isolated populations that barely interacted with each other for tens of thousands of years. Under this scenario, Perry's ancestors weren't hybrids carrying ghost DNA from some unknown cousin species. They were fully human, just human from a branch that broke away from the rest of the family and lived in near total isolation long enough for their DNA to drift dramatically apart from everyone else's, before eventually reconnecting with the wider human population at some later point. Either way, the picture of human origins that most people carried in their heads, a single clean line moving steadily out of Africa, spreading across the globe in a relatively orderly fashion, started to look far too simple. The real story looked more like a river delta than a line. Channels of humanity splitting apart, running in isolation for tens of thousands of years, sometimes drying up entirely, sometimes reconnecting downstream, mixing again, before splitting once more. The story didn't end with Perry alone. If his Y chromosome carried such an ancient signature, researchers wanted to know if anyone else on Earth carried something similar. A lone genetic outlier could be written off as some kind of anomaly, but if the same deep lineage showed up somewhere else, especially somewhere in Africa, the case for an entire hidden population, not just an isolated individual, would become far stronger. They found it. Among the Embo people, a relatively small ethnic group living in the rainforests of western Cameroon, researchers identified Y chromosome markers strikingly similar to the ones carried by Perry. This wasn't supposed to happen by coincidence. The genetic similarity between Perry's lineage and the Embo lineage suggested a shared origin point somewhere deep in West Central Africa, a region researchers had not previously flagged as a hotspot for this kind of ancient genetic divergence. Suddenly, this wasn't just the story of one man's surprising ancestry test. It was the story of a population hidden in plain sight, carrying genetic material that stretched back further than almost anything else ever recorded in a living human being. Picture the deep forests of Cameroon, generation after generation of people living their lives, raising children, passing down language and custom and memory, with absolutely no awareness that locked inside their cells was a genetic signature connecting them to a lineage older than the fossil record of anatomically modern humans itself. Nobody in that village woke up one day to discover they were carrying ancient DNA. The discovery happened entirely in a laboratory, pieced together from blood samples and computer models, completely invisible to the people who carried it, until scientists thousands of miles away ran the numbers and realized what they were looking at. When the original findings were published, they made global headlines. The man who rewrote human evolution, father of all men found in South Carolina. Stories ran in newspapers and science blogs across the world, each one trying to capture the strange, almost uncomfortable feeling of learning that the deepest root of the human family tree might not have been fully mapped after all, that somewhere out there, hidden in populations nobody had thought to closely examine, there might be other branches, just as old, just as unexpected, waiting to be found. But here's where the story takes a turn that most viral posts conveniently leave out. Because as exciting as the 338,000-year figure was, it didn't go unchallenged. Science doesn't work by headline. It works by replication, scrutiny, and argument. And, almost immediately, other researchers began digging into the methodology behind that number. A separate team of geneticists published a detailed critique a year after the original paper came out. They argued that the eye-catching age estimate had been produced using analytical choices that consistently inflated the result. Mutation rate assumptions, statistical models, the specific way the researchers had calibrated their molecular dates, and all of it, the critics argued, pushed the number higher than the evidence actually supported. When they reran the analysis using what they considered more defensible methods, the age of the Aozura lineage's divergence came out closer to 208,000 years, with a confidence range running from roughly 164,000 to 260,000 years. Still extraordinarily old. Still older than most previous estimates for the root of the Y chromosome tree, but meaningfully younger than the headline-grabbing 338,000 figure that had circulated across the internet. The original researchers did not take this quietly. Several of them pushed back hard, defending their original methodology and accusing the critics of misunderstanding key aspects of their analysis. The critics responded in turn, accusing the original team of relying on assumptions that couldn't be tested or falsified. It became, in the driest sense possible, an academic fight, conducted through journal articles and technical rebuttals rather than headlines, far away from the public eye that had already moved on to the next viral science story. And then a third group entered the conversation. In 2015, another team of researchers, working independently and using a different, broader data set of global Y chromosome sequences, arrived at yet another estimate. Their analysis placed the age of the Ahor's Druid lineage somewhere between 192,000 and 307,000 years, a range that essentially split the difference between the two competing camps, while still confirming the central, undeniable point. Whatever the exact number, this lineage was old, older than almost anything else mapped on the human Y chromosome tree, old enough to push the boundaries of what scientists thought they understood about how deep human genetic diversity actually runs. So where does that leave the story? Not with a single, clean number that can be repeated with total confidence. The honest answer sits somewhere in a range, roughly 190,000 years on the conservative end, all the way up to 340,000 years on the high. End of the original estimate. Different teams, different methods, different assumptions about how quickly mutations accumulate in human DNA over time, each pulling the number in a slightly different direction. What every single one of these competing analyses agrees on, however, is that Albert Perry's YI and the related lineage discovered among the Embo people represents the single oldest branch of the human paternal family tree ever identified in a living population. Not a fossil, not a bone fragment pulled from a cave. A living, breathing genetic lineage, carried quietly through generation after generation, completely undetected until modern sequencing technology finally caught up to it. What makes this discovery so unsettling, in the best sense of the word, is what it implies about everything we don't know yet. For decades, the dominant model of human evolution, the so-called out-of-Africa model, painted a picture of relatively continuous, interconnected populations across the African continent before a relatively recent migration out into the rest of the world. The discovery of AO0, regardless of which exact dating estimate turns out to be most accurate, suggests something messier and more interesting. It suggests that early human populations in Africa weren't one continuous, intermixing group. They were fragmented, isolated, pockets of people living apart from each other for tens of thousands of years at a stretch, accumulating their own genetic distinctiveness before sometimes eventually reconnecting. This idea has a name among researchers who study it: deep population structure. Instead of imagining early Homo sapiens as a single growing population gradually spreading outward, deep population structure imagines small, semi-isolated bands scattered across the African continent, separated by distance, by geography, by climate, sometimes for periods longer than the entire span of recorded human history put together. Some of those bands eventually merged back together. Some, perhaps, vanished entirely, their unique genetic signatures lost forever, except in the rare cases where a fragment of their DNA survived by sneaking into a population that did go on to thrive. That is perhaps the most haunting possibility buried inside the Albert Perry story. If his Y chromosome really did originate from a once isolated, now vanished population that, at some point, briefly came back into contact with the wider human gene pool, then we are looking at the genetic ghost of a group of people who otherwise left almost no trace. No fossils confidently attributed to them, no tools, no campsites identified as theirs specifically. Just this one thread of DNA, preserved by chance, passed down through thousands of generations, surviving the Atlantic slave trade, surviving centuries of forced displacement, surviving everything until it finally surfaced in a laboratory sample taken from a man in South Carolina who simply wanted to know where his family came from. It's worth pausing on that detail because it's easy to get lost in the abstract numbers and forget the very human core of this story. Albert Perry's descendants weren't trying to make scientific history. They were trying to recover something that had been deliberately erased. Generations of African American families have hit the same wall when tracing their ancestry, a wall built by the transatlantic. Slave trade, by the systematic destruction of records, by the simple brutal fact that enslaved people were frequently denied even the basic dignity of having their names and origins recorded. DNA testing has become, for many of these families, one of the only available tools for piecing together fragments of a history that was taken from them. Nobody expected that, in this particular case, the fragments being pieced together would stretch back not just centuries, but hundreds of thousands of years, deep into the prehistory of the species itself. There's a strange symmetry buried in that, a history erased by violence and forced displacement turning out to contain, encoded silently in the body, one of the oldest and most significant genetic discoveries in the history of human evolutionary science. The same systems that tried to strip away identity ended up, decades later, revealing an identity stretching back further than science had previously imagined possible. Since the original 2013 discovery, researchers have continued to refine their understanding of Aorzuru and its place in the human story. Additional sampling efforts have looked for related lineages in other parts of Central and West Africa, trying to map exactly how widespread this ancient branch actually is, and whether more divergent lineages, branches even older than Aorzuru, might still be waiting to be found. The regions of Central Africa where Aorzuru has been detected remain some of the least genetically sampled areas on Earth, meaning the full picture of how deep and how widespread these ancient lineages run is still very much incomplete. Every additional sample taken from these regions carries the possibility of pushing the story even further, of uncovering yet another branch nobody anticipated. This is part of what makes the case so significant beyond the headline number. It isn't really about whether the precise age is 200,000 years or 338,000 years. It's about what the discovery reveals regarding how much of human genetic history remains unmapped, sitting quietly inside populations that have simply never been extensively studied by Western genetic researchers. It contains by a wide margin the greatest amount of human genetic diversity of any continent on Earth, a direct consequence of the fact that anatomically modern humans have lived there the longest, giving mutations the most time to accumulate and diversify. And yet, for decades, the vast majority of large-scale genetic studies focused disproportionately on populations outside of Africa, particularly in Europe and parts of Asia, simply because those populations were easier and cheaper to sample at scale. The discovery of Aorzuru served as a pointed reminder of exactly how much may have been missed, hiding in plain sight in populations that mainstream genetic research had largely overlooked. Every time a new ancient lineage surfaces, whether it's Aorzuru in Cameroon and South Carolina, or related discoveries of unexpectedly old mitochondrial lineages identified in other African populations in more recent years, the same underlying message repeats itself. The story of human origins is not a finished book. It is being actively rewritten, sample by sample, as researchers slowly fill in the enormous gaps left by decades of uneven sampling. So what do we actually know with confidence at the end of all this? We know that a man named Albert Perry carried a Y chromosome lineage so distinct from every other documented human lineage that it required an entirely new branch to be added to the human family tree. We know that related markers have been found among the Embo people of Cameroon, tying this ancient lineage to a specific, identifiable region of West Central Africa. We know that multiple independent research teams, using different methods, have confirmed that this lineage is exceptionally old, even if they continue to disagree on the exact number, with estimates ranging from roughly 190,000 years on the low end to as much as 340,000 years on the high end, with the original headline figure of 338,000 sitting near the upper boundary of that contested range. And we know that the implications of this discovery, regardless of which precise number eventually wins out among researchers, point toward a far more fragmented, far more complicated picture of early human evolution than the simple, linear story most of us grew up learning. To really understand why this discovery hit the scientific community so hard, it helps to understand what the Y chromosome actually is and why geneticists treat it almost like a time capsule. Most of our DNA gets shuffled every generation, mixed and recombined, from both parents in a process that scrambles the genetic record almost beyond recognition after just a few generations. The Y chromosome is different. It passes from father to son largely unchanged, generation after generation, with only the occasional small mutation accumulating along the way. Because those mutations build up at a roughly predictable rate, scientists can use them almost like tree rings, counting backward, through time to estimate when two lineages last shared a common ancestor. The same principle applies to mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child and is used to trace maternal lineages back to a similarly nicknamed common ancestor, mitochondrial Eve. Neither Y chromosome Adam nor mitochondrial Eve were the only man or woman alive in their respective eras. They were simply the most recent individuals whose direct, unbroken lines of descent happen to still be traceable in every living person today. Every other lineage that existed alongside them eventually died out, not because those other people failed to have children, but simply because, over enough generations, by pure chance, some family lines run out of sons or run out of daughters and disappear from the traceable record, even while other descendants continue on through different paths. This is part of why the discovery of Aorzuru was so jarring. It didn't just add a new branch near the existing root. It potentially pushed the entire root itself backward in time, by tens of thousands of years at minimum, possibly by well over 100,000 years if the original estimate holds any weight. Imagine spending decades carefully mapping out a family tree, confident you've identified the very first ancestor at the top, only to have someone walk in with documentation proving an entire additional generation existed above the one you thought was the beginning. That is roughly the scale of revision being proposed here, except instead of one extra generation, we're talking about an entire branch representing tens of thousands of years of additional, previously unaccounted for human history. It's also worth placing this discovery alongside what we've learned about Neanderthals and Denisovans, because the comparison sharpens exactly why the interbreeding hypothesis carries real weight. When researchers first sequenced Neanderthal DNA from fossilized remains found in Europe, they discovered something remarkable. Traces of that Neanderthal genetic material still exist in the DNA of most people with non-African ancestry today, the lingering evidence of interbreeding events that occurred tens of thousands of years ago as modern humans expanded out of Africa and encountered Neanderthal populations already living across Europe and parts of Asia. A similar story emerged with the Denisovans, an archaic human population identified almost entirely through DNA evidence extracted from a handful of bone fragments found in a Siberian cave whose genetic legacy lives on most strongly in populations across Melanesia and parts of Asia today. In both cases, scientists discovered evidence of these vanished populations, not primarily through abundant fossil remains, but through genetic echoes preserved in the bodies of their distant descendants. If Azor really does represent the genetic legacy of an archaic, now vanished African population, interbreeding with early modern humans, it would essentially be the African counterpart to the Neanderthal and Denisovan stories already well established in the scientific literature. And the difference is that, unlike Neanderthals and Denisovans, we don't currently have any confirmed fossil remains to attach to this hypothetical population. We have no skull, no jawbone, no campsite confidently linked to whatever group originally carried this lineage. All we have is the genetic echo itself, surviving quietly inside a small number of living people, with no physical remains yet discovered to put a face, however reconstructed, to the story. That absence is precisely what makes the case both so compelling and so difficult to fully resolve. Without fossil evidence, researchers are left working almost entirely from statistical inference, comparing mutation patterns and modeling plausible scenarios, which is exactly why the dating dispute between different research teams has proven so difficult to settle definitively. There is no tidy ending here, no single confirmed number to close the story with a bow. That, in its own way, is the most honest takeaway of all. The deeper scientists dig into the genetic record, the more obvious it becomes that human evolution wasn't a straight line marching steadily toward us. It was a sprawling, branching, sometimes fragmenting, sometimes reconnecting, on playing out across hundreds of thousands of years, across an entire continent we have barely begun to fully sample. Somewhere out there, in populations that have never had their DNA closely studied, there may be other lineages just as old, just as unexpected, just as capable of forcing scientists back to the drawing board. Albert Perry never lived to see what his DNA would reveal. He never knew that the simple act of his descendants searching for a lost family history would end up contributing to one of the most debated and significant findings in modern human evolutionary genetics. He was, by every account, an ordinary man living an ordinary life in 20th century America. And yet, inside him, silently, invisibly, carried forward through countless generations, completely unaware of what they were passing along, was a fragment of a story stretching back to the very edge of what it means to be human at all. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Somewhere in Central Africa, hundreds of thousands of years before anyone wrote a word of recorded history, before the pyramids, before agriculture, before language as we would recognize it today, a small group of people lived, loved, struggled, and eventually had children whose descendants would carry a single thread of unbroken paternal lineage forward through an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. That thread survived ice ages. It survived migrations. It survived the rise and fall of countless civilizations that never knew it existed. It survived the brutal centuries of the transatlantic slave trade, passed from father to son in chains on plantations through generations who had no idea what they carried. And it survived all the way to a man named Albert Perry, born in a country that, for most of its history, refused to even acknowledge the full humanity of people who looked like him, let alone recognize that his body held one of the most extraordinary genetic records on the entire planet. That is what makes this discovery feel less like a footnote in a genetics journal and more like a genuine reckoning with how little we actually understand about where we came from. A reminder that history isn't only written in monuments and texts and fossils pulled carefully from ancient soil. Sometimes it's written directly into the body, waiting quietly, patiently for someone to finally ask the right question.